But without exception, in every country I visited, there was one commonality. God was there. I saw him on multiple occasions, blessing an endless variety of people, whether they acknowledged him or not. All right, Genesis 14, the capture of Lot and his nephew, introduction to Melchizedek. As Kevin was referencing, I just got back from Lubbock, watching and listening to Billy knock it out of the park. One thing I find invariably amusing at these places, because there's always a lot of people hustling and bustling and coming and going, typically at a faster than normal pace, because everybody's in between lectures and they want to make sure they get a good seat or a seat at all. And the amusing part for me is watching the dance around the doors. Who's going to open the door for whom? I've never quite understood the etiquette. I'm easily confused. You know, I opened it last time. Who's going to open it this time? Is it me again? Is it them? I just opened one. Are you allowed to open two in a row? How long do I open it and stand there? Who do I let past? Is it just my friends? Immediate circle? Do I do that little acknowledging nod and pass it on to one of the group behind me, or do I let the group in? And if I let others in, how many of them is how? I mean, I could be there all day. And should I go out of my way to allow others the privilege of holding the door open? Because that's what it is, right? It's a privilege. Opening a door for someone is the elevation of the other human. It's saying, please, no, you before me. It's placing oneself behind another. It's the lowering of oneself, allowing another person to be first. But in God's world, it's good to serve, it's good to be selfless, it's good to be last, and there's reward involved. So that being the case, I shouldn't hog all the doors, thus robbing everyone else of the reward. Others must be allowed to open the door for whoever they believe to be more important than themselves. Yes? They must be allowed to open the door for whoever they believe to be more important than themselves. Tricky business, this door holding. I bet you didn't think it was as complicated. Or maybe it's just good manners. Anyway, in this chapter, a different kind of door is being held open for us. A curtain is being lifted, and we're granted access to witness Abraham and Lot's warring neighbors. As all these little budding empires are beginning to jostle for position and supremacy in the region. And because it kind of spills over, or spills upon, or at least close enough to Abraham and Lot's territory, the all too often inevitability of war is brought sharply into focus in this chapter. Lot, who in the last chapter chooses this land from which he is captured, because he considered it to be the best land. Well, in this chapter, Lot's about to learn that all that glitters is not gold. And news of these events eventually trickles back to Abraham, who quickly and unhesitantly rallies the troops. 318 trained men. I'm assuming it wasn't trained musicians that he called upon, or trained hairdressers, trained pastry chefs that he was calling on. Rather, men who were trained in the art of fight, of war, men's men, the type of men that men call when we're in trouble. Masculine man. Part of the West problem right now, you'll have noticed with masculinity, is that we haven't really had to depend on masculine for a very, very long time. I guarantee you the same people who are constantly wailing about toxic masculinity would be standing to attention, saluting the troops and waving the banners in about 5 seconds if the Chinese army was lined up against your border. Easy to disregard something you believe that you have no need for. Abraham had obviously decided that it's better to have and not need than need and not have. And standing in the wings were 318 trained fighters. This great man of faith. 318 trained fighting men. Why didn't he just faith Lot back into Sodom? Jesus said a mustard seed of that stuff could move a mountain. If it can move a mountain, it can move Lot. Here we find Abraham possessing enough men's men to remedy this situation and bring about the righteous judgment of God. And it is the righteous judgment of God. When we get to verse 20, Melchizedek blesses Abraham and says, "Blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand." So Abraham begins to move and act here as God's rod of justice, rescuing what was lost and stolen and restoring it to whom it had been taken. That alone could preach for the next 15 minutes. And although Abraham's not without his faults, he demonstrates here that he also possesses some of the finer qualities of man. A keen sense of justice, fairness, integrity, God-honoring integrity. The chapter, by virtue of the raised curtain, provides us a little glimpse as to how the surrounding nations, these budding little empires, it lets us see how they're all progressing after Babel and how the human family is functioning outside the covenant that God has with Abraham. We typically don't see those things in Scripture because Scripture is typically so focused on the single thread. And we find that the outside world isn't entirely godless, because we'll see in the presence of Melchizedek that God loves and blesses and has relationship with people beyond the boundaries of his covenant with Abraham. But it's godless enough to let us see how a world left to its own devices often perhaps typically acts and behaves without God. And it's good that we get to see this, because it helps us remove any speculation and forbids us from doing what we're often capable of doing, and that is ignorantly over-dramatizing or over-romanticizing the nature of the human family. Such is the brutality, of course you know this, I don't need to tell you this, such is the brutality of the Holocaust. We have people who doubt that it ever happened. In spite of all that evidence, because they're unwilling to admit that the people they favor could ever stoop so low. Personally, I find it extremely bewildering that I can find very few people over here in the US who are knowledgeable about the atrocities of the native Indian tribes within the Americas, the wars and the cannibalization, the human sacrifices, among other things that existed here before the first settlers arrived. Or perhaps they're simply unwilling to admit that the people they favor could ever stoop so low. In such regard, we fall prey to overly romanticizing that which we are ignorant of, or that we choose to be ignorant of, because we know that civilization, any civilization that is without God, His word, and therefore His influence on their daily life and habits, and it's as true everywhere else as it was here in the Americas, these civilizations typically don't fare too well in regards to ethics and morals. Not that ethics and morals don't exist within such people, they do, but they're man-made, man-driven, and therefore they typically only function to self-guard the people who decide what the morals and the ethics are for their group. Melchizedek, however, for all that we don't know about him, will prove that as godless as the world can be, life with God is possible outside the parameters of God's isolated covenants. But these warring tribes help us understand that it was certainly far from the norm. It appears that Abraham wasn't overly familiar with the phrase, "to the victor goes the spoils." And in this little episode, Abraham demonstrates that when God champions your heart, it isn't quite as cut and dry as "to the victor go the spoils." I'm sure you found out in your own life that when God champions your heart, very few things in this world are cut and dry. I've used this text a million times, even a simple little text like Leviticus 23:22. Simple gardening advice, farming advice. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor, for the foreigner. And that sounds simple enough. Don't harvest all the way up to the edge. All right, that's easy. Until someone asks, how big is an edge? Here in Genesis chapter 14, the spoils don't go to the victor. Abraham willfully, seemingly gladly dispenses of the spoils. He has no need for them. He has no desire for them. Contrast this with just the previous chapter when Lot chooses what is good and plentiful for himself, apparently without any regard for Abraham or what's good for Abraham. And now Abraham gets to teach Lot and anyone else who cares to be watching a far, far better way. Demonstrates how one thinks, how one chooses, when Yahweh drives the heart. And if you've read the Bible at all by now, you'll know that we really don't know much about this Melchizedek character. Although Hebrews chapter 7 stresses that he's a greater man than Abraham. That's why he's the one who receives the tithe. And for all Abraham's faults, his priorities here, he's quite the knight in shining armor in this little passage. And his priorities here are quite considerable. And before the king of Sodom gets his share, Abraham, upon learning of Melchizedek, makes sure that God gets his. And it's interesting that Abraham wants nothing to do with the bounty. But then, when there's a chance to honor God with it, jumps all over it. He finds no problem in using the bounty to honor God, but he will not be honored by it. And we don't really know who Melchizedek is because we're not really told. But obvious is this: God honoring people existed outside the covenant of Abraham, and they were loved by God, and they were blessed by God, and evidently had a relationship with him, a loving, obedient, saving even relationship. And not only does Abraham greet him, he gladly acknowledges his own inferiority before him in handing over the tithe, gladly submits, not a sign of jealousy or envy or bitterness. It looks as though Abraham was simply delighted that there were more people like him in the world. People who believed in God and who walked with God. So the appearance of Melchizedek, although leaving us in the dark in regard to his origin or placement in this world, stands to remind us, as McGuigan says, that Abraham's God, like Israel's God, like our God, is no sectarian. He's no isolationist, interested in only a select few. Melchizedek's words forbids such a view of God, refers to Yahweh as the creator of heaven and earth. The earth is the Lord's and all within it, the world and all who live in it. And so we're reminded again that God will be who God will be. And we don't get to determine that. And he'll be wherever he wants to be, and we won't have a word to say about it. And he'll be with who he'll be with. And he's not hanging around waiting for our approval. But if we're honest, we can struggle with this sometimes. Not falling far from our tree. Often behaving like spoiled little school children, you know, when we have a friend, but they're our friend. And, well, quite frankly, we don't want them to be anyone else's friend. They're our friend, you see. And if they are someone else's friend, sometimes we can get bitter and jealous. The church has struggled, and I imagine it still does, with this idea sometimes. Israel struggled with it. Sometimes we want God to be our friend and only our friend and exist within the parameters that we can see or perceive. This is unacceptable. Israel certainly struggled with the concept, even although their very own confession was that they were the people of Abraham. Therefore, their own confession condemns the attitude that Jesus often encountered. God is our God. Pete's sake, oftentimes the leadership in Israel even wanted to separate their own people who, were sinners. They wanted to separate their own people from any meaningful relationship with God. Never mind outsiders. They didn't believe God could have a relationship with someone outside the parameters of their four little walls. But Abraham had no trouble believing it. Jesus had no trouble believing it. Peter was taken up on a roof and forced to eat a potluck and forced to believe it. But Abraham, he wasn't found walking 2 inches above the ground thinking he's all that, thinking he's the be-all and end-all because of his special covenant with God, thinking that because God chose to be his friend, that must mean everyone else who isn't like Abraham can't be friends with God. Back in 2006, I don't know, I don't do dates. But sometime around then, when I traveled around the world and I was trying to lose myself or find myself, but I managed neither. But without exception, in every country I visited, there was one commonality. God was there. I saw him on multiple occasions, blessing an endless variety of people, whether they acknowledged them or not, though some certainly did. Abraham's character and actions here are commendable. But he's faced with a choice. Should he accept the spoils of war that he had rightly won, but whereby someone somewhere down the line would have been able to say that man made Abraham who and what he was? The king of Sodom gave these to me. Or does he reject the spoils, which would force everyone into the conclusion that God made Abraham who and what he was? And where those around him might still refuse to believe in Yahweh, they wouldn't be able to say that Abraham didn't believe in Yahweh. And they were left with nowhere else to point in regard to the source of Abraham's blessings. So now, following this event, wherever and whenever Abraham would have been discussed throughout the land, this story would be told and God would be honored and referenced, because this would be a story. No one is not going to tell the story about the guy who gave up the bounty. And every time that story was rehearsed, God's glory was increased. And because of what he did, the God who blesses humans would be spoken of in the region as a God to be considered. Now, Abraham had previously left Egypt, a far greater and wealthier man, having received fortune from then. But we don't know all the circumstances, Egypt's or Sodom's. Simply that in this circumstance with Sodom, and it could very well be their increasing reputation of immorality and the depth to which they were rapidly sinking, that Abraham wanted nothing to do with it. But whatever it was, Abraham wanted nothing to do with it. So we'll see from this chapter, the God who is the creator of heaven and earth is our God. And there's much joy in that. But we don't own him. We don't possess him. We don't get to set his limits or his borders. He does that. And when we do it, we're proving yet again that we haven't traveled far from the garden, still enamored by the thought that we want to be like God and do the things that only God can do. In carrying Lot and his nephew into captivity, the world's warring and prideful ways came so close to God's covenantal plan that they had to be dealt with. So, evident here, and will increasingly unfold as the chapters open to us, the reader begins to realize that God is up to something with this man Abraham. And what he is up to is that he has started to right the world. He's moved from minor keys to major keys, aiming it all toward Jesus and the saving of the human family. The overarching narrative, God's redemptive acts within a fallen world, is not up for grabs. It won't be altered. It won't be hindered. So in short, these warring nations made so much noise that God arrived because they lived next door. In Genesis 14, these idiots messed around and found out. But Abraham's priorities here, his actions, are considerable. I hope, sometimes against hope, I must confess, but I hope that by the time I die, some of the things I've done and some of the things I've said will have accomplished at least this, that God was honored in some small way, that given half a chance, it was his name that sprang from my lips, that it was his greatness that was acknowledged and recognized. And even if those around me slander the name of the Lord, may it never be said that I did it. So that even if they were to disregard everything I stood for, at least they knew the one I stood for. And if those around me refuse to believe in God, hopefully they'll be unable to say that I refuse to believe in him also. Abraham, for all his faults, just like the greats that'll come after him, including, of course, Jesus. But Abraham and the greats, what made them so great? They held the door open for God. They held the door open for God. Thoughts, comments, questions?